You know, it's always fascinating how some people pretend to understand a language they were never meant to speak, the millionaire said in smooth Arabic, his lips curling into a quiet, private smile he assumed no one else in the room could decode, and for a moment the clinking of glasses and low jazz humming through the Manhattan restaurant continued untouched until the meaning of his words settled invisibly over the table like a shadow that only one person could truly see, Naomi. Carter stood beside him holding a polished silver tray steady at chest height, her posture straight, her expression calm, her dark eyes lowered just enough to be respectful but not submissive, the soft glow of the chandelier above catching the neat braids pulled back from her face. She looked like any other waitress moving silently through a Friday night dinner rush, unnoticed, replaceable. Exactly the kind of person Richard Whitmore had built a life overlooking, dismissing, categorizing in a single glance. He leaned back in his chair, expensive suit perfectly tailored, cufflinks glinting under the warm light, confident in the quiet laughter exchanged between his guests who didn't understand the words but recognized the tone, the hierarchy, the unspoken permission to find amusement at someone else's expense. Naomi didn't move, not immediately. The air seemed to stretch thinner around her as the words replayed in her mind, precise, deliberate, each syllable chosen to diminish, to test, to assert control without consequence. Across the room a server dropped a fork and it clattered against the hardwood floor, but even that small sound felt distant compared to the silence building inside her chest. Her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the tray, not enough for anyone to notice, just enough for her to ground herself. Richard reached for his glass of red wine, swirling it lazily as if the moment had already passed, as if nothing of importance had happened at all. Because in his world it hadn't. People like her didn't respond, didn't challenge, didn't exist beyond the role assigned to them. "Excuse me," Naomi said softly, her voice steady, almost gentle, and yet something in it caused the man beside Richard to glance up. Just for a second, she lowered the tray onto the edge of the table with careful precision, the faintest click of metal against marble marking a shift no one could yet name. Then she lifted her gaze fully for the first time, meeting Richard's eyes without hesitation, without apology. And in that brief connection something unfamiliar flickered across his face, not fear, not yet, but confusion, the kind that comes when a script you've followed your entire life suddenly stops working. Naomi tilted her head just slightly, as if considering him, as if measuring not his wealth or status but something far more human, something far more fragile. "Sir," she continued, her tone still calm, still respectful, "would you like me to correct your Arabic?" The words landed clean, unmistakable, cutting through the room sharper than any raised voice could have, and for the first time that evening the laughter stopped, not gradually, not politely, but completely, like a switch had been flipped. Richard's hand froze midair, the stem of his glass hovering inches above the table, his expression locked between disbelief and calculation as he searched her face for any sign of uncertainty, any hint that this was a bluff, a mistake, something he could easily dismiss. But Naomi didn't look away, didn't waver. The restaurant seemed to hold its breath around them. The soft music still playing somewhere in the background now felt distant, irrelevant, as if the entire space had narrowed to the few feet between them, and in that silence, that fragile, suspended moment, the balance of power began to shift in a way no one at that table had expected, least of all him. Richard Whitmore did not move, not at first, his fingers still wrapped around the stem of the glass as if letting go might confirm something he was not ready to face. The faint reflection of the chandelier shimmered across the surface of the wine, distorting slightly with the subtle tremor he could not quite control. He let out a small, breathy laugh, the kind meant to dismiss, to shrink the moment back into something harmless, something manageable. "That is quite a claim," he said slowly, his voice measured, careful, eyes narrowing just enough to study her, to search for cracks. "Do you often correct your guests, or am I receiving special treatment tonight?" A few quiet chuckles returned around the table, uncertain, cautious, the kind of laughter that waits for permission. Naomi did not respond immediately. She simply reached for the water pitcher and poured a steady stream into an empty glass, the soft sound of liquid meeting crystal cutting through the tension. With surprising clarity, she placed the glass gently in front of him, her movements precise, unhurried, as if time itself had slowed to match her control. "Only when it matters," she said, her tone even, not sharp, not defensive, just certain. Richard leaned back in his chair, setting the wine glass down now, finally, but his gaze did not leave her. Something in his posture shifted, subtle but unmistakable, no longer relaxed, no longer entirely in command. "Then by all means," he gestured lightly with his hand, a performance of confidence that did not quite reach his eyes. "Enlighten me." Naomi nodded once, as if accepting a formal invitation, then she spoke, the words flowing in Arabic with a clarity and rhythm that felt different from his, not rehearsed, not decorative, but lived, grounded, every syllable placed with intention. The table fell silent again, but this time it was not confusion that filled the space, it was recognition. Even those who did not understand the language could feel the difference, could hear the precision. Naomi paused just long enough to let the sound settle, then she translated, her voice returning to English without hesitation. "You said that people like me should learn to smile more and speak less if we want to keep our jobs," she stated plainly, not raising her voice, not accusing, simply revealing. The words landed heavier in English, stripped of the illusion of cleverness, of distance. One of the women at the table shifted uncomfortably. Another looked down at her plate, suddenly very interested in the arrangement of her fork. Richard's jaw tightened, just slightly, barely noticeable unless you were watching closely. "That is not exactly what I said," he replied quickly, too quickly, the edge of defensiveness slipping through despite his effort to contain it. Naomi met his gaze without flinching. "No," she agreed softly. "It is what you meant." The room seemed to shrink again, the air thick with something unspoken but undeniable. Richard straightened, adjusting his cuff as if reclaiming control through small, familiar gestures. "And you are certain you understood correctly?" he pressed, his tone cooler now, sharper. Naomi tilted her head slightly, a hint of something almost like curiosity crossing her expression, not amusement, not mockery, but something quieter, steadier. "I am certain," she said, then after a brief pause she added, "You also misused the verb in your second sentence." A faint ripple moved through the table, not laughter this time, but surprise. Richard blinked, just once, the smallest crack in the composure he had spent decades perfecting. "Excuse me?" Naomi continued, still calm, still composed. "The structure you use changes the meaning. It makes your statement sound less intentional, more careless," she explained, not correcting him like a subordinate, not challenging him like an equal, but speaking with the quiet authority of someone who did not need either position to be heard. Richard opened his mouth, then closed it again, the response he had prepared dissolving before it could form. For the first time that evening he was not controlling the narrative, not guiding the tone. The attention of the table had shifted, subtly but completely, no longer anchored to his presence, but to hers. Naomi reached for her tray once more, lifting it with the same steady grace as before, as if nothing extraordinary had happened at all, as if this moment did not exist to elevate her or diminish him, but simply to reveal what had already been true. And in that quiet, undeniable clarity, Richard felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest, not anger, not embarrassment, but something far more unsettling, the realization that he had spoken in a language he thought no one around him could understand, and still, somehow, he had been seen completely. Naomi turned slightly as if to step away, the edge of the moment already beginning to settle into something quieter, something almost ordinary again. But before she could take a single step, Richard's voice followed, sharper now, not raised, but tightened with something he had not needed to use in years. "Wait," he said, the word landing heavier than he intended. She paused, not out of obligation, but because she chose to, slowly turning back to face him once more, the tray balanced effortlessly in her hand. The room remained still. Every movement now measured, observed, held under an invisible lens that none of them could escape. Richard leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table, his fingers interlaced, a posture that once commanded boardrooms and negotiations, but here, now, it felt different, less dominant, more searching. "Where did you learn that?" he asked, his tone controlled, but no longer dismissive, no longer certain. Naomi regarded him for a brief moment, her expression unreadable, not guarded. Not open, simply present. Does it matter? She replied gently, the question not defiant, but honest. Richard exhaled through his nose, a faint smile pulling at one corner of his mouth as if he recognized the shift, but refused to fully surrender to it. It does when someone corrects me in my own conversation, he said, attempting to reclaim ground, to reposition himself within the structure he understood. Naomi stepped closer to the table, not invading, not retreating, simply closing the distance enough that her voice did not need to rise. I learned because I had to, she said, her tone still calm, still even, but now carrying something deeper, something rooted beyond the room, beyond the moment, a quiet weight that could not be dismissed. Richard's eyes flickered, just slightly. That is not an answer, he replied, though the edge in his voice had softened. Naomi nodded once, as if acknowledging the truth in that. Then she placed the tray down again, slower this time, more deliberate, the faint sound marking another shift, another line crossed. My father worked as a translator, she began, her gaze steady. He sat in rooms like this, only the tables were longer and the stakes were higher, and the people speaking believed that language gave them power. The guests exchanged subtle glances, no longer amused, no longer detached, but drawn in despite themselves. Naomi continued. He used to tell me that language does not create power, it reveals it. Richard's fingers tightened slightly against each other, the words landing somewhere deeper than he expected, somewhere he could not immediately categorize or dismiss. And you followed in his footsteps? He asked, quieter now. Naomi shook her head gently. No, she said. I listened. The simplicity of the answer settled over the table, heavier than anything she had said before. Richard leaned back again, but this time the movement lacked its earlier ease, his shoulders not quite as relaxed, his posture not quite as certain. And now you serve tables? He said, the words hovering between observation and something else he could not fully define. Naomi did not react to the implication, did not defend, did not explain. She simply met his gaze and answered. For now. The two words carried no shame, no apology, only a quiet certainty that made them feel larger than they were. A silence followed, not uncomfortable, not empty, but full, as if the room itself was adjusting to a new understanding it had not been prepared for. One of the men at the table cleared his throat softly, then stopped, unsure of what to say or whether he should say anything at all. Richard's eyes remained on Naomi, studying her, reassessing the careful calculations he had relied on his entire life no longer fitting the equation in front of him. You could have ignored what I said, he finally remarked, his voice lower now, almost reflective. Naomi gave a small nod. I could have, she agreed, but then you would have believed it did not matter. The statement was not an accusation, not a correction, but a truth offered without weight or force, and somehow that made it impossible to dismiss. Richard's gaze dropped briefly to the glass of water in front of him, the surface still, reflecting a version of himself that felt slightly unfamiliar, slightly altered. When he looked back up, the confidence was still there, but it had changed shape, less rigid, less absolute. And what do you believe now? He asked, the question quieter than any he had asked before. Naomi lifted the tray once more, her movements returning to their earlier rhythm, composed, steady. That you heard me, she said simply, then turned, not waiting for permission, not seeking approval, just moving forward, leaving behind a silence that no one at the table seemed willing to break. And for the first time that evening, Richard Whitmore did not try to fill it. The soft hum of conversation slowly returned, but it no longer carried the same ease, the same effortless rhythm it had only minutes before. It moved carefully now, like people stepping across a surface they were no longer sure would hold their weight. Richard Whitmore remained still for a moment longer after Naomi walked away, his gaze following her across the restaurant as she blended seamlessly back into motion, refilling glasses, adjusting place settings, offering quiet smiles to other guests who had no idea what had just unfolded only a few feet away. And yet something about the way she moved felt different now, not to her, but to him, as if a layer had been removed, revealing something he had not noticed, or perhaps had chosen not to see. Richard, one of the men at the table said cautiously, breaking the silence with a voice that tried to sound casual but carried a hint of unease. "She is impressive," another added, attempting a light tone, though it landed unevenly. Richard did not respond immediately, his attention still fixed on the space Naomi had just occupied, the words she had spoken lingering in his mind, not loud, not aggressive, but persistent. "Language does not create power, it reveals it," he repeated silently, the phrase settling deeper with each passing second. He reached for his glass again, finally taking a slow sip of the wine, but the taste felt different now, less sharp, less satisfying, as if something in the room had shifted the experience itself. He set the glass down with a quieter motion than before. "She was out of line," he said after a moment, his voice measured, but lacking the certainty it once carried. The others exchanged quick glances, unsure whether to agree or remain silent. "Or honest," one of the women offered gently, her eyes flicking toward him with careful consideration. Richard's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in resistance, the kind that comes when a perspective challenges something long held. "There is a difference," he replied, though even as he said it, the distinction felt less clear than it once had. Across the room, Naomi paused briefly near the service station, placing her tray down as she listened to another server speak quickly, her expression attentive, focused, completely unbothered by the attention she had just drawn. She nodded once, then picked up a fresh set of glasses, moving again with quiet efficiency, as if the moment at Richard's table had already been filed away, processed, and released. Richard watched this with a growing sense of unfamiliarity. He was used to reactions, to responses that lingered, that sought acknowledgement or validation, but she had given neither. She had simply spoken, and then continued. "You should let it go," the man beside him said quietly, leaning in just enough that his voice would not carry. "It is not worth making a scene." Richard let out a small breath, almost a laugh, though it carried no humor. "A scene," he repeated, the word feeling misplaced. "She corrected a sentence, not challenged my authority." He paused, then added more quietly, "At least not directly." The subtle admission did not go unnoticed. The woman across from him tilted her head slightly, studying him. "You are thinking about it," she observed, not accusing, simply stating what was already clear. Richard did not deny it. Instead, he leaned back once more, though the posture no longer carried the same weight, the same command. It felt more like an attempt to regain something that had shifted beyond simple adjustment. "People reveal more than they intend when they believe no one is listening," he said slowly, almost to himself, the irony of the statement not lost on him. The others fell quiet again, allowing the thought to settle, allowing him space he rarely needed but now seemed to. Across the restaurant, Naomi approached another table, her voice soft, professional, asking if everything was satisfactory. The couple seated there smiled warmly, thanking her, their interaction simple, genuine, untouched by the tension that had just unfolded elsewhere. Richard noticed the difference immediately, the ease in their exchange, the absence of hierarchy, of performance, and for a brief moment, something inside him shifted again, not dramatically, not visibly, but enough to register, enough to unsettle. "Bring her back," he said suddenly. The words quiet but firm. The table looked at him, surprised. "For what?" the man beside him asked. Richard's gaze remained steady, not on them, but on Naomi across the room. "I would like to finish the conversation," he replied, and though his tone was controlled, there was something new beneath it, not dominance, not dismissal, but something closer to curiosity, something closer to respect, the kind he had not expected to offer, and perhaps had not realized he withheld. A moment passed before the woman across from him gave a small nod, signaling to another server, who hesitated briefly before moving toward Naomi, and as she turned, beginning to walk back toward the table once more, Richard felt that same unfamiliar stillness return, not the stillness of control, but the stillness of anticipation, of stepping into something he could not fully predict, and for the first time in a long time. He did not try to shape what would come next, he simply waited. Naomi noticed the shift before she reached the table, not because anyone called her name, not because of a gesture or a signal, but because the air around that space felt different, heavier, more deliberate, the kind of stillness that follows a moment no one can quite explain but no one can ignore either. She approached with the same measured steps, the same composed posture, her tray resting lightly against her palm, but her eyes, steady and observant, registered the change immediately. The laughter was gone, replaced by something quieter, something watching. Richard Whitmore did not look away this time as she arrived. His gaze met hers directly, not with the dismissive glance of a customer expecting service, but with a focus that suggested something unfinished, something unresolved. "You asked for me," Naomi said calmly, her voice even, neither warm nor cold, simply present. Richard gave a small nod, his hands resting on the table, no longer folded in authority, no longer performing control, just placed there, open, visible. "I did," he replied, his tone steady, though softer than before. He paused briefly, as if choosing his next words with more care than he was accustomed to. "I would like to understand something." Naomi remained still, attentive, but not deferential. "What is it you believe I revealed?" he asked, the question direct, but lacking the edge it might have carried earlier. The table grew quiet again, not out of tension this time, but out of anticipation, as if everyone present understood that this moment carried more weight than the one before. Naomi considered him for a second, not hesitating, but measuring, not his status, but his intent. "You revealed what you assumed," she said simply. Richard's brow tightened slightly, not in confusion, but in concentration. "And what did I assume?" he pressed. Naomi shifted the tray slightly in her hand, the movement small, almost absent, but grounding. "That no one here would understand you," she answered, her voice calm, steady. "And that even if they did, it would not matter." The words settled into the space between them, not sharp, not confrontational, but clear, undeniable. Richard exhaled slowly, his gaze dropping for just a moment before returning to her. "That is a practical assumption," he said, though the conviction behind it felt thinner now. Naomi gave a faint nod, acknowledging the logic without agreeing to its weight. "Practical does not mean harmless," she replied, the statement quiet, but firm in a way that did not invite dismissal. One of the guests shifted in their seat, the subtle sound of fabric against leather marking the only interruption. Richard leaned forward slightly, his posture now less about control and more about engagement. "And you believe correcting me changed that?" he asked. Naomi met his gaze without hesitation. "No," she said. "I believe it revealed it." The distinction lingered. Heavier than the words themselves, Richard's fingers tapped once lightly against the table, a habit, a rhythm he had used in countless negotiations, but here it felt out of place, almost unnecessary. "You speak as if you have done this before," he observed. Naomi allowed the smallest hint of a smile to touch her expression, not amusement, not pride, but recognition. "I have listened before," she said, echoing her earlier words. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in focus. "And what did you hear?" he asked. Naomi did not answer immediately. Her gaze moved briefly across the table, taking in the faces now turned toward her, attentive, curious, no longer distant. Then she returned her focus to him. "That people often say the most about themselves when they believe no one is paying attention," she said, her tone unchanged, steady, grounded. Richard let out a quiet breath, the corners of his mouth shifting, not quite a smile, not quite a concession, but something closer to acknowledgement. "And what does that say about me?" he asked, the question softer now, stripped of performance. Naomi held his gaze for a moment longer than before, not to challenge, not to dominate, but to ensure the answer would land where it needed to. "That you are used to being heard," she said, "but not used to being understood." The words did not accuse, did not judge, they simply settled, and in that simplicity, they carried more weight than anything said before. The table remained silent, no one moved, no one interrupted. Richard sat back slowly, the motion unforced, almost reflective, his eyes no longer searching for a flaw, but absorbing something he had not expected to encounter, something he could not immediately reshape into advantage. Naomi lifted her tray slightly, preparing to step away once more, her role returning, her presence no longer centered but still undeniable. "Is there anything else I can bring you?" she asked, her voice returning to its professional tone, but not losing its depth. Richard looked at her for a moment longer, then shook his head once, slowly. "No," he said quietly, then after a brief pause he added, "You already did." Naomi gave a small nod, not in agreement, not in acknowledgement of praise, but simply marking the end of the exchange, and as she turned and walked away, the space she left behind did not return to what it had been before. It held something new, something quieter, but far more difficult to ignore. And for the first time that evening, Richard Whitmore did not reach for his glass, did not fill the silence with conversation, he simply sat there, listening to something he had never needed to hear until now. The restaurant slowly resumed its rhythm, but it was no longer the same rhythm that had filled the room earlier that evening. Something subtle had shifted beneath the surface, like a current running quietly under still water, unnoticed by some, but impossible to ignore once felt. Richard Whitmore remained seated, his posture composed but no longer effortless, his gaze no longer scanning the room for influence or opportunity, but drifting back, again and again, to the space Naomi had just left. Behind, his guests began to speak again, cautiously at first, their voices returning in fragments, carefully avoiding the center of what had just occurred. "The market will adjust by next quarter," one of them offered, attempting to restore familiarity. Another nodded, adding a brief comment about projections and margins, but their words floated without weight, disconnected from the attention that had once anchored them. Richard heard them, but he did not listen, not in the way he had built his life around listening, calculating, responding. His mind remained elsewhere, replaying the exchange, not the words themselves, but the spaces between them, the pauses, the calm certainty in Naomi's voice, the absence of hesitation. He reached for his glass again, then stopped midway, his hand hovering for a second before lowering back to the table, the gesture small, almost invisible, but it marked something he could not name. Across the room Naomi moved between tables with the same steady presence, refilling water, clearing plates, offering quiet acknowledgments to guests who barely glanced up. Her world had not changed, her responsibilities remained the same, and yet the contrast between how she moved and how he now perceived that movement had grown impossible to ignore. She was not performing, not adjusting, not reacting, she was simply continuing, and that, more than anything she had said, unsettled him. "You are distracted," the woman across from him said gently, her tone no longer probing, but observant. Richard looked at her, not defensive, not dismissive, just aware. "Am I?" he replied, though the answer was already evident. She gave a small nod. "You usually finish your wine by now," she said, glancing briefly at the untouched glass. Richard followed her gaze, then looked back up, a faint, almost reluctant smile touching his expression. "Perhaps I am trying to taste something else," he said quietly, the words surprising even himself. The table fell into a softer silence, not tense, not expectant, but reflective, as if the conversation had shifted into a space none of them had planned to enter. "You could speak to her again," the man beside him suggested, his voice lower now, less concerned with control and more with resolution. Richard considered this, his eyes drifting once more toward Naomi, who now stood near the far end of the room, listening to an elderly couple with patient attention, nodding gently as they spoke, completely present in a way that felt rare, almost unfamiliar in a place built on transactions. "No," Richard said after a moment, his voice steady, but softer than before. "I already heard what I needed to hear." The statement settled, not final, but grounded, as if something within him had reached a point of quiet understanding. The others did not argue, did not question, they simply accepted the shift, the absence of the need to dominate the moment, to control its outcome. Richard leaned back slightly, his posture now relaxed in a different way, not imposed, not constructed, but eased, his eyes no longer searching for Naomi, but aware of her presence without needing to fixate on it. He picked up his glass again, finally taking a sip. The taste familiar this time, but layered with something else, something less sharp, less immediate, something that lingered. He set the glass down gently, his fingers resting against the table, still composed. The conversation around him resumed more naturally now, but he did not rush to lead it, did not steer it back to numbers or strategy. Instead he listened, not for advantage, not for opportunity, but simply to hear, and across the room, Naomi continued her work, unaware of the exact shape of the change she had set in motion, but fully aware of the truths she had spoken, and as the night carried on, the distance between them remained, unchanged in space, but altered in meaning, no longer defined by hierarchy alone, but by a moment that had quietly, undeniably, rewritten the way one man understood the room he thought he controlled. The evening stretched on, but the energy around Richard Whitmore's table no longer revolved around him in the same effortless way it once had. Conversations continued, deals were mentioned, plans were outlined, but something quieter had taken root beneath it all, something that did not demand attention yet refused to disappear. Richard found himself listening more than speaking. His usual rhythm of guiding discussions replaced by a slower, more deliberate awareness. He noticed things he would have ignored before, the slight hesitation in a colleague's voice, the way one guest nodded without truly agreeing, the careful politeness that often masked disinterest, and for the first time in a long time, he did not immediately move to correct or control it. He simply observed, absorbing the room as it was rather than shaping it into what he expected it to be. Across the restaurant, Naomi continued her work. Her movements steady, her focus unwavering, but there was a moment, brief and almost imperceptible, when her eyes lifted and met his again from across the room, not searching, not inviting, just acknowledging, and in that quiet exchange something settled, not tension, not challenge, but recognition, as if both understood that the conversation between them had not ended, it had simply changed form. Richard gave the smallest nod, not a signal, not a command, but something closer to respect. Naomi returned her attention to the table in front of her without pause, without need for further acknowledgement, and that was enough. The woman seated across from Richard watched this subtle exchange, her expression thoughtful. "You are different tonight," she said softly, her voice carrying no judgment, only observation. Richard leaned back slightly, considering the statement, his fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table. "Different how?" he asked, not defensive, but curious. She smiled faintly. "You are not trying to win every sentence," she replied, the words simple, but precise. Richard let out a quiet breath, a hint of something reflective crossing his features. "Maybe I realize not every sentence is a competition," he said, and though the comment might have sounded light on another night, here it carried weight, it carried change. The man beside him raised an eyebrow slightly, intrigued. "And what made you realize that?" he asked. Richard's gaze drifted briefly toward Naomi again, then back to the table. "Someone who did not need to compete to be heard," he answered, his tone calm, unembellished, the truth of it settling into the space without resistance. No one responded immediately, not because they disagreed, but because there was nothing to add. The clarity of the statement left little room for anything else. A server approached to clear plates, moving efficiently, quietly, and Richard thanked him, a small gesture, almost routine, but delivered with a presence that felt more intentional than before. The server paused for a fraction of a second, surprised, then nodded and moved on. The table resumed its conversation, but now it flowed differently, less structured, less driven by a single voice, and Richard allowed it. He participated when it felt natural, he listened when it did not, and for once, that balance did not feel like a loss of control. It felt like something else entirely, something steadier, something real. As the night moved closer to its end, guests began to gather their belongings. Chairs shifted softly against the floor, the low hum of departure replacing the earlier buzz of arrival. Richard reached for his coat, draping it over his arm, but before he stood, his eyes moved once more across the room, finding Naomi near the entrance, speaking quietly with the host. Her posture relaxed, her presence unchanged. He held that image for a moment, not as a question, not as a challenge, but as something to carry forward. Then he stood, the movements smooth, unhurried, and as he turned to leave the table behind, he realized something that did not come with a sudden revelation or dramatic clarity, but with a quiet, undeniable certainty. That the most significant conversation he had that evening was not the one he controlled, but the one he had not expected, the one that did not bend to his voice, and for the first time in a very long time, he did not feel the need to have the last word. The front doors opened with a soft rush of cool night air, the kind that carried the distant hum of the city and the faint echo of passing traffic, and as Richard Whitmore stepped toward the exit, the polished floor beneath his shoes reflecting the warm glow of the restaurant behind him, he slowed, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness, his gaze shifting slightly to the right where Naomi now stood near the host's stand. Finishing a quiet exchange with the departing couple, she thanked them. With a small, genuine smile, the kind that did not perform but simply existed, and as they walked out into the night, she turned, her eyes briefly scanning the room before settling, unexpectedly but naturally, on him. The distance between them remained unchanged, several yards, a few passing guests, the soft clink of glassware being reset for the next seating, but the moment held, steady, unforced. Richard adjusted his coat over his arm, not as a gesture of status, but as something routine. Something grounding, and then, without summoning her, without signaling, he took a few steps closer, closing just enough of the space to speak without raising his voice. Naomi met him there, not stepping forward, not stepping back, simply present. "You are leaving," she said calmly, her tone observational, not questioning. Richard nodded once. "I am," he replied, his voice quieter than it had been when he arrived hours earlier, less polished, more real. A brief pause followed, not uncomfortable. Not searching, just open, as if both understood that whatever needed to be said would come without force. Richard glanced toward the door for a moment, then back to her. "I have spent most of my life believing that control comes from knowing more than the people around me," he said slowly, the words measured but not rehearsed. Naomi listened, her posture unchanged, her attention steady. "And tonight?" she asked gently, not prompting, not guiding, just allowing the thought to continue. Richard let out a soft breath, something close to a quiet acknowledgement. "Tonight I realized it also comes from assuming less," he said, the statement simple, but carrying the weight of something earned. Naomi gave a small nod, not in agreement or approval, but in recognition of the truth within it. "Assumptions are easy," she replied, her voice calm. "Understanding takes more time." Richard's lips curved slightly, not into a smile meant to impress, but into something smaller, more honest. "Time is something I have always measured in outcomes," he said, "not in moments." Naomi's gaze softened just slightly, not with sympathy, but with clarity. "Then maybe this was a useful moment," she said, and though her tone remained even, there was a quiet warmth beneath it. Richard held her gaze for a second longer than before, not searching, not evaluating, just present. "It was," he said simply, the certainty in his voice no longer tied to control, but to understanding. Another pause settled between them, lighter this time, less charged, more complete, the kind that follows a conversation that has reached its natural end. Richard shifted his coat slightly, preparing to leave, but before he turned, he added, "You were right." The words not dramatic, not heavy, but clear. Naomi tilted her head just slightly. "About what?" she asked. Richard met her eyes. "About being heard and being understood," he said. Naomi held his gaze for a moment, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "They are not the same," she replied softly. Richard inclined his head in acknowledgement, a gesture that carried more meaning than any elaborate apology could have. And with that, he turned, stepping toward the door, the cool air meeting him again as he crossed the threshold. The city unfolding beyond the glass, loud, alive, indifferent, but something within him had shifted, not dramatically, not in a way that demanded recognition, but in a way that would remain, that would surface in moments yet to come. Behind him, Naomi returned to her position, her work continuing, her presence steady, unchanged in form but now quietly acknowledged in meaning, and as the door closed gently behind him, the reflection in the glass no longer showed just a man leaving a restaurant, but someone carrying a conversation that would not be left behind. The city outside moved with its usual urgency, headlights cutting through the night, footsteps echoing along the sidewalk, conversations blending into the distant rhythm of Manhattan after dark. But Richard Whitmore did not immediately step into it. He paused just beyond the restaurant doors, the cool air settling against his skin, his reflection faintly visible in the glass behind him. For a moment he simply stood there. Not checking his phone, not calling for a car, not rushing toward the next engagement, just present in a way that felt unfamiliar, deliberate. He glanced back once, through the tall windows, the warm light inside framing the space he had just left, and there, near the host stand, Naomi moved again with quiet purpose, greeting new guests, guiding them to their table, her voice calm, her expression steady. Nothing about her had changed, and yet everything about how he saw her had. He exhaled slowly, the breath visible in the cool night air, then reached into his coat pocket, pulling out his phone. His thumb hovered over the screen for a moment, the usual instinct to move forward, to fill the next hour, the next day, the next deal, but instead he lowered it again, slipping it back into his pocket, the decision small, almost insignificant, but it carried weight, a quiet refusal to return immediately to the pace he had always known. Inside, Naomi adjusted a menu on the host stand, her fingers smoothing the edge instinctively, the small details that kept everything in place. A new couple approached, their voices light, expectant. She greeted them with the same steady presence, guiding them forward, and as she turned, just for a second, her eyes moved toward the window, not searching, not expecting, simply aware, and she saw him still standing there, not leaving, not lingering for attention, just there. Their eyes met once more, through glass and distance, and in that silent exchange there was no need for words. No need for continuation. The conversation had already done its work. Richard gave the slightest nod, not formal, not rehearsed, just real, and Naomi returned it with the same quiet acknowledgement before turning back to her work. The moment complete, Richard finally stepped forward, the city opening around him as he moved, the sounds returning, the motion resuming, but something within him carried a different rhythm now, not slower, not softer, but more aware, more intentional. As he walked down the sidewalk, he passed people he would have once overlooked, a man adjusting his tie under a streetlight, a woman balancing 2 coffee cups as she hurried across the corner, a doorman greeting a resident with a familiar nod. Small moments, ordinary, but no longer invisible. He noticed them, not because they demanded attention, but because he allowed himself to see them. A car pulled up beside him, the driver stepping out quickly. "Mr. Whitmore," he called, holding the door open. Richard paused, then shook his head lightly. "Not yet," he said, his voice calm. The driver hesitated, surprised, then nodded and stepped back. Richard continued walking, his pace unhurried, his hands resting loosely at his sides, the city lights reflecting off the pavement ahead, and as he moved forward, he realized something that did not arrive as a revelation, not as a sudden shift, but as a quiet understanding that settled into place. That power was not in being the only voice heard, but in recognizing the voices that had always been there, and for the first time in a long time. He did not feel the need to rise above them. He felt something else entirely, something steadier, something grounded. Inside the restaurant, Naomi continued her shift, clearing tables, guiding guests, her presence unchanged in form, but not unnoticed, not anymore. And as the night carried on, both of them moved forward in their separate worlds, connected not by circumstance, not by status, but by a moment that had revealed something simple and lasting, that respect does not arrive with volume, or wealth, or position. It arrives in the quiet choice to see, to listen, and to understand, and once that choice is made, it does not leave, it